Retired woman faces financial ruin. Her creative solution inspired the entire community and changed her life. Hello, welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. Helen had never imagined her life could change so drastically in just a few short months. Once surrounded by the comfort of her home, the memories of a lifetime, and the love of her late husband, she now found herself standing in the middle of an empty house, clutching the only thing left that held any meaning: a dusty, old recipe book passed down from her grandmother. The walls echoed with the silence of loss, and the emptiness around her felt like a reflection of the despair growing in her heart. How did she end up here, with everything she ever knew slipping through her fingers? But in the darkest moment of her life, a spark ignited. Hidden within the worn pages of that recipe book was something that could change everything. Something that would challenge Helen in ways she never thought possible. A journey of rediscovery, resilience, and an unexpected twist of fate was about to unfold. One that would not only save her, but inspire an entire community. What could a simple recipe hold that would turn a life of despair into a story of triumph? The answer lies in the most surprising of places. But first, you must step into Helen's world, where every choice she makes will leave you breathless, every emotion she feels will tug at your heart, and every turn in her path will make you wonder how far you would go to change your own fate. Helen Simmons stood motionless in the empty living room of her Victorian-style house in suburban Boston, her trembling hands clutching a framed photograph. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Dust motes danced in the pale sunlight streaming through the bare windows, highlighting the faded patches on the wallpaper where family portraits once hung. "I never thought this day would come," Helen whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. At 68, she never imagined she'd be forced to leave the home where she'd raised her children and shared a lifetime with her late husband, John. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now stood eerily quiet. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly around her, each one a painful reminder of the life she was being forced to leave behind. Helen's eyes darted from one box to another, memories flooding her mind with each label she read. Kitchen. One box proclaimed in bold black marker. Helen's mind drifted to countless Thanksgiving dinners, the aroma of roast turkey and pumpkin pie filling the air as her family gathered around the large oak table. She could almost hear the clinking of glasses and the sound of her grandchildren's laughter. John's study, another box read. Helen's heart clenched as she remembered her husband hunched over his desk, working tirelessly to provide for their family. The image of John's kind eyes and warm smile brought a fresh wave of tears to her eyes. The doorbell's shrill ring shattered her reverie, causing Helen to jump. She hastily wiped her eyes and smoothed her silver hair before opening the door. The real estate agent, a young man in an ill-fitting suit, stood on the porch, an apologetic smile on his face. "Mrs. Simmons," he said softly. "It's time." Helen nodded numbly, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as the agent began his final walkthrough of the house, checking windows and doors. Each room he entered felt like another piece of her heart being torn away. As the agent disappeared upstairs, Helen found herself drawn to the attic door. She hesitated for a moment before climbing the narrow stairs, her arthritic knees protesting with each step. The attic was dim and musty, filled with forgotten treasures and discarded memories. Helen's eyes fell on a small, ornate box tucked away in a corner. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing a stack of yellowed recipe cards. "Grandma Rose's recipes," Helen breathed, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. She flipped through the cards, each one a cherished memory of her grandmother's kitchen. As she reached the last card, a small folded note fluttered to the floor. Helen bent to retrieve it, her heart racing as she unfolded the fragile paper. In her grandmother's elegant script were the words, "For the darkest of times." Before she could examine the note further, the real estate agent's voice echoed from downstairs. "Mrs. Simmons? Are you ready?" Helen clutched the recipe box to her chest, a sudden determination filling her. She may have lost her home, her savings, and her security, but she still had her family's legacy. With a deep breath, she descended the attic stairs, prepared to face whatever came next. As Helen handed over the keys to her beloved home, she felt a strange mix of despair and hope. The weight of the recipe box in her arms seemed to ground her, offering a lifeline in the storm of uncertainty that lay ahead. The agent's car disappeared down the tree-lined street, leaving Helen alone on the sidewalk. She turned to take one last look at the house that had been her sanctuary for over 4 decades. The setting sun cast a golden glow on the weathered clapboards, making the house look warm and inviting, as if it were saying its own goodbye. Tears streamed down Helen's face as she whispered, "Goodbye, old friend. Thank you for the memories." With a heavy heart, Helen walked away from her past and toward an uncertain future. The recipe box tucked under her arm held not just cherished family recipes, but perhaps the key to her survival. As she headed towards her new life in a small, unfamiliar apartment across town, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that her grandmother's mysterious note was more than just a family keepsake. Little did Helen know that the contents of that box would soon become her lifeline, igniting a series of events that would not only change her life, but inspire an entire community. The journey ahead would be filled with unexpected twists, heartbreaking sacrifices, and moments of pure joy. But for now, all Helen could do was put one foot in front of the other, holding on to the hope that somehow, someway, she would find the strength to rebuild her life from the ashes of financial ruin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Helen took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown. The weight of her past balanced precariously against the uncertainty of her future. The first chapter of her new life was about to begin, and it promised to be one filled with challenges, surprises, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance at redemption. The tiny apartment Helen now called home felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Bare walls echoed her footsteps as she paced the cramped living room, her mind a whirlwind of worry and regret. The sound of sirens and car horns filtered through the thin windows, a stark reminder of how far she was from the peaceful suburban life she once knew. Helen's gaze fell on the stack of unpaid bills on the rickety coffee table. Her meager pension barely covered rent, let alone food and medications. The weight of her financial ruin pressed down on her, threatening to crush what little spirit she had left. With a heavy sigh, Helen sank into the threadbare armchair, the only piece of furniture she'd managed to keep from her old life. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the worn fabric, memories of happier times flickering through her mind like an old film reel. "Oh, John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What am I going to do?" As if in answer, her eyes landed on the recipe box perched on the windowsill. Sunlight glinted off its tarnished brass corners, seeming to beckon her. With trembling hands, Helen retrieved the box and opened it, the scent of old paper and faded ink washing over her. She shuffled through the recipe cards until she found the mysterious note from her grandmother. "For the darkest of times," it read. Below was a recipe Helen had never seen before, titled simply Hope's Kitchen Soup. Curiosity piqued, Helen read through the ingredients. Most were common enough, but a few were puzzling. A pinch of starlight? 3 drops of a happy tear? Helen shook her head, wondering if her grandmother had lost her mind in her later years. Despite her skepticism, Helen felt compelled to try the recipe. What did she have to lose? With renewed energy, she gathered what ingredients she could from her sparsely stocked kitchen. As she chopped vegetables and stirred the pot, Helen found herself humming an old tune her grandmother used to sing. The familiar melody soothed her frayed nerves, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of peace. The aroma that filled the tiny apartment was unlike anything Helen had ever experienced. It was comfort and nostalgia, hope and possibility, all wrapped up in a savory embrace. When she finally tasted the soup, tears sprang to her eyes. It was more than delicious. It was transformative. A knock at the door startled Helen from her reverie. She opened it to find Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor, looking concerned. "I smelled something wonderful," Mrs. Chen said, her eyes twinkling. "I wanted to make sure everything was all right." You've been so quiet since you moved in." Helen hesitated for a moment before inviting Mrs. Chen in for a bowl of soup. As they sat at Helen's small kitchen table, she watched in amazement as Mrs. Chen's face lit up with the first spoonful. "This is incredible," Mrs. Chen exclaimed. "What's your secret?" Before Helen could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Mr. Guzman from across the hall, drawn by the enticing aroma. Soon, Helen's tiny apartment was filled with neighbors, all raving about the miraculous soup. As the impromptu gathering wound down, Mrs. Chen pulled Helen aside. "You know," she said softly, "the community center down the street is always looking for volunteers to help with their soup kitchen. With your talent, you could really make a difference." Helen felt a flutter of excitement in her chest, the first she'd felt in months. Could this be the opportunity she'd been waiting for? As she bid goodbye to her last guest, Helen caught sight of her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her looked different. There was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. With a small smile, Helen picked up her grandmother's recipe card. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered. "I think I've found my way." Little did Helen know that this small pot of soup was about to set in motion a series of events that would not only change her life but impact her entire community. As she cleared the dishes, humming softly to herself, the first tendrils of hope began to take root in her heart. Outside, the city continued its chaotic dance of light and sound, but inside Helen's apartment, a transformative calm had settled. The recipe box sat on the counter, a silent guardian of secrets yet to be revealed. As night fell, Helen drifted off to sleep, her dreams filled with possibilities and the comforting aroma of hope. The community center's kitchen bustled with activity as Helen stirred a large pot of her now famous Hope's Kitchen soup. The aroma wafted through the air, drawing in volunteers and patrons alike. It had been 3 months since she first shared her grandmother's recipe, and word had spread fast in their tight-knit Boston neighborhood. "Helen, you've outdone yourself again," praised Maria, the center's coordinator. "I swear, more people show up each week just for a taste of your soup." Helen blushed, still unused to the attention. "Oh, it's nothing special," she demurred, but deep down, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the steam rising from the pot. As she ladled out bowls of soup, Helen's mind drifted to how much her life had changed. The tiny apartment no longer felt like a cage, but a cozy nest. Her neighbors had become friends, and for the first time since John's passing, she felt part of a community again. The lunch rush was in full swing when a sharply dressed man entered the kitchen. He introduced himself as Robert Caldwell, a local businessman and restaurateur. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his eyes gleaming with interest, "I've heard remarkable things about your soup. I'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Helen's heart raced. A business proposition? She hadn't considered her soup as anything more than a way to give back to the community. But as Robert laid out his vision, bottling and selling her soup in local stores, Helen couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement. "Think about it," Robert urged. "You could help so many more people this way. And, of course, there's potential for significant profit." As Helen pondered the offer, she noticed a young woman hovering near the soup pot, surreptitiously snapping photos with her phone. Alarm bells rang in Helen's head. "Excuse me," Helen approached the woman. "May I ask what you're doing?" The woman startled, nearly dropping her phone. "I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I'm Jenny from the Boston Globe. We've been hearing buzz about this amazing soup, and I was hoping to do a story." Helen's mind reeled. A newspaper story? This was all happening so fast. She glanced around the kitchen, suddenly aware of the many eyes upon her. The hungry patrons, the eager volunteers, Robert with his business proposal, and now a reporter. It was overwhelming. That night, Helen tossed and turned in her bed, Robert's words echoing in her mind. The prospect of turning her soup into a business was tempting. Could solve her financial troubles and allow her to help even more people. But something didn't sit right. She reached for her grandmother's recipe box, running her fingers over the worn edges. The original note fell out, "For the darkest of times." Was this what her grandmother had intended? To turn a family secret into a profit-making venture? A knock on her door startled Helen from her thoughts. It was Mrs. Chun, looking worried. "Helen, dear, I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, wringing her hands. "It's just, well, there's something you should know." Mrs. Chun explained that her nephew, who worked at a local food processing plant, had overheard his bosses discussing plans to replicate Helen's soup recipe. They had apparently obtained a sample and were reverse engineering it. Helen felt the blood drain from her face. Her secret recipe, her grandmother's legacy, was at risk of being stolen. But how? And then it hit her. The young woman with the phone at the community center. She must have been more than just a reporter. As Mrs. Chun left, Helen sank into her armchair, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She was at a crossroads. She could partner with Robert, potentially securing her recipe and financial future. Or she could keep things as they were, risking losing control of her grandmother's precious gift. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. This wasn't just about soup anymore. It was about honoring her family's legacy, about the community she'd come to love, and about staying true to herself. As dawn broke, Helen made her decision. She would meet with Robert, but not before she had a plan of her own. She wouldn't let anyone exploit her grandmother's recipe, not without ensuring it would benefit those who needed it most. With trembling hands, Helen picked up the phone to call Robert. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm ready to talk business, but I have some conditions of my own." As she hung up, Helen caught her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had first moved into this apartment. There was a steely determination in her eyes now, a resolve born of adversity and hope. Little did Helen know, her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would test her integrity, challenge her compassion, and ultimately redefine her understanding of success and community. The journey ahead would be far from smooth, but armed with her grandmother's recipe and her own growing strength, Helen was ready to face whatever came her way. Outside, the city was waking up, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky in hues of hope. As Helen prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than herself. The price of fame, she was learning, was high, but the rewards of staying true to oneself were immeasurable. The crisp autumn air nipped at Helen's cheeks as she made her way down the tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill. The historic brownstones loomed above her, their windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Helen's meeting with Robert Caldwell had left her with more questions than answers. His eagerness to commercialize her soup had sparked a nagging curiosity about its origins. Now, standing before an imposing Victorian house, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The door creaked open, revealing a stern-faced woman in her late 70s. "Aunt Mildred," Helen said softly. "It's been a long time." Mildred's eyes narrowed. "Helen? What in heaven's name are you doing here?" As Helen explained her quest to uncover the truth about her grandmother's recipe, Mildred's expression shifted from suspicion to resignation. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," she sighed, ushering Helen inside. The house was a time capsule, filled with antique furniture and faded photographs. Helen's eyes were drawn to a portrait of her grandmother, Rose, hanging above the fireplace. The woman's kind eyes seemed to follow her, holding secrets Helen was only beginning to unravel. Mildred disappeared into a back room, returning with a dusty box. "Your grandmother made me promise to keep this safe," she explained, her voice tinged with reluctance. "Said it was for when the time was right." With trembling hands, Helen opened the box. Inside, she found old letters, newspaper clippings, and a small, leather-bound recipe book. As she leafed through the yellowed pages, a photograph slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Helen gasped as she picked it up. The image showed her grandmother, much younger, standing in front of a soup kitchen. The sign above read, "Hope's Kitchen, EST 1932. "It was during the Great Depression," Mildred explained, her voice soft with memory. Your grandmother's soup kept half of Boston fed during those dark years. People said it was magical, that it could lift spirits and heal hearts. As Helen listened, the pieces began to fall into place. The mysterious ingredients, the note about the darkest of times, it all made sense now. Her grandmother's recipe wasn't just a family secret. It was a piece of history, a beacon of hope during one of America's most challenging periods. But why keep it a secret? Helen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mildred's eyes clouded with emotion. Because power like that, it comes with a price, Helen. There were people who wanted to exploit it, to use it for their own gain. Your grandmother chose to protect it, to keep it pure. A chill ran down Helen's spine as she remembered Robert's eager plans and the attempted recipe theft. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. As the evening wore on, Mildred shared more family stories, each one adding layers to the rich tapestry of Helen's heritage. But with each revelation came a growing sense of responsibility and danger. It was well past midnight when Helen finally left, her arms laden with the box of family secrets. As she waited for her taxi, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a face Helen recognized from old family photos, her cousin, Thomas. "Hello, Helen," he said, his voice cold. "I hear you've been asking questions about Grandma Rose's recipe. I'm afraid I can't let you continue down this path." Helen's heart raced. "Thomas, what are you talking about?" His eyes narrowed. "That recipe is worth millions to the right buyer. You have two choices. Hand it over to me, or watch as I destroy everything you've built. Your little soup kitchen, your reputation, everything." Before Helen could respond, Thomas's car sped away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, shaken to her core. As her taxi navigated the late-night streets of Boston, Helen's mind whirled with the evening's revelations. The recipe that had given her new purpose was so much more than she'd ever imagined. It was a legacy, a responsibility, and now a source of danger. Back in her small apartment, Helen carefully stored the box of family treasures. As she closed the closet door, her eyes fell on the framed photo of her late husband, John. "What would you do?" she whispered, longing for his steady presence and wise counsel. Sleep eluded her that night. Helen tossed and turned, her dreams a chaotic mix of Depression-era soup lines, Thomas's threats, and her grandmother's kind eyes. As dawn broke, she sat up in bed, a decision crystallizing in her mind. She couldn't run from this. The recipe, and all it represented, was her heritage, her responsibility. But protecting it would mean taking on forces she barely understood, risking everything she'd rebuilt. With shaking hands, Helen reached for her phone. She had calls to make, plans to set in motion. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them head-on. For her grandmother, for her community, and for herself. As the first rays of sunlight painted her small apartment in hues of gold, Helen felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and difficult choices. But for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Little did Helen know, her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life but impact her entire community in ways she could never have imagined. The battle for her grandmother's legacy was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than she'd ever dreamed. The community center bustled with activity as Helen ladled out steaming bowls of her now-famous soup. The lines snaked out the door, a testament to the recipe's growing popularity. But beneath her warm smile, Helen's heart raced with anxiety. It had been a week since Thomas's threat, and Helen felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. Every friendly face in line now held the potential for suspicion. Was that person really here for soup, or were they trying to steal her recipe? The paranoia was exhausting. "Helen, dear, are you all right?" Maria's concerned voice cut through her thoughts. "You seem distracted today." Helen forced a smile. "Just a bit tired, that's all." As the last patron left, Helen sank into a chair, her mind whirling. The recipe book felt like it was burning a hole in her bag. She had to make a decision, and soon. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the public garden in an hour. Come alone." Tea. Helen's hands shook as she read the message. This was it. The moment of truth. The autumn air was crisp as Helen made her way through the public garden. The swan boats were docked for the season, and fallen leaves crunched under her feet. She spotted Thomas sitting on a bench near the pond, his expression unreadable. "Hello, cousin," he said coolly as she approached. "Have you made your decision?" Helen took a deep breath. "Thomas, why are you doing this? This recipe. It's meant to help people, not to make us rich." Thomas's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand, Helen. Do you know how much our family has struggled while sitting on this gold mine? My father, your uncle, died penniless because Grandma was too stubborn to sell. But the recipe's purpose. Purpose." Thomas scoffed. "Wake up, Helen. This is business. That recipe could set our whole family up for life. Think about your grandchildren's future." Helen felt her resolve wavering. The thought of securing her family's financial future was tempting. But then she remembered the faces of those she served at the community center, the stories Aunt Mildred had shared about the Great Depression. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she said quietly, "but I can't let you exploit this. The recipe stays with me." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, Helen. I promise you that." As he stormed off, Helen felt a mix of relief and dread. She had made her choice, but at what cost? The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Helen threw herself into her work at the community center, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange cars lingered on her street, and she caught glimpses of unfamiliar faces in the crowd at the soup kitchen. Then came the first blow. A scathing article appeared in the local paper, accusing Helen of exploiting volunteers and pocketing donations. Though the claims were baseless, the damage to her reputation was immediate. "Helen, what's going on?" Maria asked one day, her voice laced with concern. "People are asking questions, and I don't know what to tell them." Helen wanted desperately to confide in her friend, to share the burden of her secret, but she knew that would only put Maria at risk. "It's just a misunderstanding," Helen assured her. "It'll blow over soon." But it didn't. The whispers grew louder, and Helen watched helplessly as the number of volunteers dwindled. Even some of her regulars at the soup kitchen began to eye her with suspicion. One rainy afternoon, as Helen was closing up the kitchen, she received a call from an unknown number. "Mrs. Simmons?" a gruff voice said. "This is Detective Harding from BPD. We need you to come down to the station. There are some irregularities in your financial records we need to discuss." Helen's blood ran cold. This was Thomas's doing, she was sure of it. As she locked up the community center, possibly for the last time, she felt the weight of her choices crushing down on her. That night, as Helen sat in her small apartment, surrounded by legal papers and the remnants of her grandmother's legacy, she faced her toughest decision yet. She could fight these baseless accusations, risking everything she had built and possibly exposing the recipe's secret in the process. Or she could walk away, preserving the recipe but losing the community she had come to love. As dawn broke, Helen made her choice. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd use. "Robert?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Helen Simmons. I think I'm ready to discuss that business proposition." As she hung up, Helen caught sight of her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her looked tired, older, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. She had made her choice for better or worse. Now she had to live with the consequences. Little did Helen know, her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only challenge her integrity but also test the very fabric of her community. The battle for her grandmother's legacy was far from over, and the biggest challenges were yet to come. The glossy boardroom of Caldwell Enterprises felt a world away from Helen's humble kitchen at the community center. Robert Caldwell sat across from her, his eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement as he slid a contract across the polished mahogany table. "Mrs. Simmons, this is a momentous day," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Once you sign, we can begin mass production of Helen's Hope Soup immediately. You'll be set for life, and your grandmother's recipe will help millions. Helen's hand hovered over the dotted line, her heart heavy. Was this really what her grandmother would have wanted? As she picked up the pen, a commotion outside the boardroom caught her attention. The door burst open, revealing a disheveled man Helen recognized as Mike, a regular at her soup kitchen. His eyes were wild with desperation. "Don't do it, Mrs. Simmons," he cried. "You can't sell out to these corporate vultures." Security guards rushed in, trying to restrain Mike, but he broke free and approached Helen, his voice breaking. "Your soup, it's not just food, saved my life, gave me hope when I had nothing. You can't let them turn it into just another product." As the guards dragged Mike away, Helen locked eyes with him. In that moment, she saw not just Mike, but every face she'd served at the community center. Every story, every life touched by her grandmother's recipe. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell," Helen said, pushing the contract away. "I can't do this." Robert's face darkened. "Mrs. Simmons, think carefully. This may be your only chance to clear your name and secure your future." Helen stood, her voice steady. "My future isn't worth sacrificing the true purpose of this recipe. I'll find another way." As Helen left the Caldwell Enterprises building, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But her relief was short-lived. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Local soup kitchen volunteer arrested for assault and trespassing. Guilt washed over Helen. Mike had put himself on the line for her, and now he was paying the price. She hailed a taxi, determined to make things right. At the police station, Helen found herself face-to-face with Detective Harding, the same officer who had questioned her about the financial irregularities. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's really going on." Over the next hour, Helen poured out the whole story: her grandmother's legacy, Thomas's threats, the attempted corporate buyout. To her surprise, Detective Harding listened with growing interest and concern. "Mrs. Simmons, what you're describing, it's bigger than just a family recipe," he said, leaning forward. "We've been investigating a series of corporate espionage cases, and I think your situation might be connected." Helen's mind reeled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Harding replied, "that we might be able to help each other, but it won't be easy, and it could be dangerous." As Helen left the station, her head spinning with new information and possibilities, she spotted a familiar face waiting by her taxi. It was Jenny, the reporter she'd met at the community center. "Mrs. Simmons," Jenny said, her eyes alight with determination. "I know you probably don't trust me, but I want to help. I've been digging into Caldwell Enterprises, and there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. If you're willing to tell your story, we might be able to expose the truth." Helen hesitated, weighing her options. Trusting Jenny was a risk, but staying silent hadn't protected her so far. And if there was a chance to clear her name and protect her grandmother's legacy. "All right," Helen said, taking a deep breath, "but we do this my way. And first, we need to help Mike." As Helen and Jenny climbed into the taxi, neither of them noticed the sleek black car parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the watchful eyes inside. Back at her apartment, Helen carefully removed her grandmother's recipe book from its hiding place. As she leafed through the pages, a small, folded note fell out, one she hadn't noticed before. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing her grandmother's elegant script. "To my dearest Helen, if you're reading this, you've discovered the true power of our family's legacy. Remember, the greatest magic lies not in the ingredients, but in the love and hope with which it's made. Trust in yourself and in the goodness of others. The path ahead may be difficult, but you are stronger than you know. With all my love, Grandma Rose." Tears blurred Helen's vision as she clutched the note to her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of real hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. As the sun set over Boston, casting long shadows across the city, Helen began to plan her next move. The battle for her grandmother's legacy was far from over, but now she had allies and a renewed sense of purpose. Little did Helen know, Her decision to stand firm against corporate pressure would spark a chain reaction throughout the community, bringing to light long-buried secrets and forcing everyone to confront the true meaning of legacy, integrity, and the power of a simple bowl of soup. The crisp autumn air nipped at Helen's face as she hurried down the streets of Boston, her mind racing faster than her feet. The events of the past few weeks had been a whirlwind, and now everything was coming to a head. Jenny's exposé on Caldwell Enterprises had sent shockwaves through the city. The article revealed a web of corporate espionage, with Thomas and Robert at the center, attempting to steal and commercialize family recipes from across the country. Helen's story was just the tip of the iceberg. As she approached the community center, Helen's heart sank. The closed until further notice sign still hung on the door, a stark reminder of the damage Thomas's accusations had caused. But today that would change. Inside, a small group had gathered. Detective Harding stood with Jenny, along with Maria and a few loyal volunteers. Their faces were a mix of determination and anxiety. "Are you sure about this, Helen?" Maria asked, her voice laced with concern. "It's a big risk." Helen nodded, her hand instinctively going to the locket around her neck, the last gift John had given her before he passed. "It's the only way," she said softly. As Helen began to explain her plan, a commotion outside caught their attention. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering. Word had spread about Helen's invitation to the entire community for a special announcement. Taking a deep breath, Helen stepped outside. The murmur of the crowd died down as all eyes turned to her. She recognized faces, some friendly, some suspicious, all curious. "Thank you all for coming," Helen began, her voice stronger than she felt. "I know there have been a lot of rumors and accusations flying around. Today, I want to set the record straight." Over the next hour, Helen laid bare the entire story: her grandmother's legacy, Thomas's threats, the corporate scheme, everything. As she spoke, she could see the crowd's expressions shifting from skepticism to shock, and finally, to understanding. "The truth is," Helen continued, her voice cracking slightly, "this recipe was never meant to make anyone rich. It was meant to bring hope and healing to a community in need. And that's what I intend to do." With trembling hands, Helen reached into her bag and pulled out her grandmother's recipe book. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "This book contains not just my grandmother's soup recipe, but dozens of others, all designed to nourish both body and soul. I've decided to donate this book to the community center, to be used for the benefit of all." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Helen raised her hand for silence. "There's more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "To fund the reopening of the community center and ensure these recipes can help as many people as possible, I've decided to sell my most precious possession." With that, Helen unclasped the locket from around her neck. "This was the last gift my late husband gave me. Its sale should cover the center's expenses for at least a year." A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew what that locket meant to Helen. The sacrifice was enormous. Suddenly, a voice called out from the back, "No, Mrs. Simmons, you can't do that." The crowd parted to reveal Mike, the soup kitchen regular who had tried to stop her at Caldwell Enterprises. He stepped forward, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You've already given us so much," Mike said. "Now it's our turn." He pulled out a crumpled bill from his pocket and placed it in a nearby donation box. "It's not much, but it's a start." As if a dam had broken, people began surging forward, dropping money, checks, and promises of volunteer hours into the box. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Tears streamed down Helen's face as she watched her community come together. This was what her grandmother's legacy was truly about, not just a recipe, but the power to inspire hope and unity. As the impromptu fundraiser continued, Helen felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Detective Harding, a small smile on his face. "Mrs. Simmons," he said quietly, "we just got word. Thomas and Robert Caldwell have been arrested. It's over." Relief washed over Helen, but it was tinged with sadness. Thomas was still family after all. but she knew she had made the right choice. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene, Helen looked out at her community, no longer divided, but united in purpose. She clasped her locket, feeling the weight of her wedding ring inside. John would have been proud. The battle for her grandmother's legacy was over, but Helen knew this was just the beginning. With the recipe book safely in the community's hands and the center poised to reopen, there was much work to be done. But for the first time in months, Helen felt truly at peace. As she turned to go back inside, ready to start planning for the future, Helen caught a glimpse of her reflection in the center's window. The woman looking back at her stood taller, her eyes bright with purpose. She had lost so much, but gained something far more valuable, a legacy of her own, built on love, sacrifice, and the enduring power of hope. Little did Helen know, her story would inspire countless others, rippling out far beyond their small corner of Boston. The healing power of her grandmother's recipes, combined with the strength of a united community, was about to change lives in ways she could never have imagined. The aroma of simmering soup filled the air as Helen stood in the bustling kitchen of the newly renovated community center. 6 months had passed since that pivotal day when the truth came to light, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The once dilapidated center now hummed with life. Volunteers of all ages moved purposefully through the spacious dining area, setting tables and greeting visitors with warm smiles. The walls, once drab and peeling, now showcased vibrant murals depicting scenes of hope and community, painted by local artists. Helen's eyes misted as she surveyed the scene. Her grandmother's recipe book, safely ensconced in a custom-built display case, held the place of honor near the entrance. But it wasn't just a relic. It was the beating heart of their operation. "Mrs. Simmons?" a young voice called out. Helen turned to see Sarah, a teenage volunteer, her eyes bright with excitement. "The news crew is here for the interview." Helen nodded, smoothing her apron. The center's success had caught the attention of national media, and today, they were featuring the story on a popular morning show. As Helen made her way to the front, she passed Mike, now the center's full-time manager, expertly coordinating the lunch service. He gave her a thumbs up and a wide grin. His journey from a struggling regular to a pillar of the community was just one of the many success stories that had unfolded over the past months. Outside, the autumn sun bathed the street in golden light. A small crowd had gathered, watching curiously as the news crew set up their equipment. Helen spotted familiar faces: Mrs. Chen, beaming proudly, Detective Harding, giving her an encouraging nod, and Jenny, notepad in hand, ready to document this latest chapter. "Mrs. Simmons?" the reporter greeted her warmly. "Thank you for having us. Are you ready to share your incredible story with the nation?" Helen took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied with a small smile. As the camera rolled, Helen recounted the journey, the hardships, the betrayals, and ultimately, the triumph of community spirit. She spoke of her grandmother's legacy, not just of recipes, but of resilience and hope in the face of adversity. "But the real story," Helen said, her voice filled with emotion, "is not about me. It's about what happens when people come together, when they choose compassion over greed, unity over division." The reporter nodded, visibly moved. "And what's next for the center, Mrs. Simmons?" Helen's eyes lit up. "We're expanding our services. Thanks to donations and grants, we're opening a job training program, literacy classes, and a community garden." The soup kitchen was just the beginning. As the interview concluded, Helen noticed a commotion at the edge of the crowd. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the figure being led forward by 2 police officers, Thomas. The crowd fell silent as Thomas approached, his eyes downcast. He looked older, worn by his time in custody awaiting trial. "Helen," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry for everything." Helen felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, pity, and a glimmer of hope. "Thomas," she replied, keeping her voice steady, "you hurt a lot of people." He nodded, shame evident in every line of his face. "I know, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make amends. If you'll let me, I'd like to volunteer here, to try and undo some of the damage I've caused." A hush fell over the gathered crowd, all eyes on Helen. This was a moment of truth, a test of the very principles of compassion and redemption she had been preaching. Helen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her grandmother's locket against her chest. She thought of all the lives that had been changed, all the second chances given within these walls. "Thomas," she said finally, "everyone deserves a chance to make things right. You can start by helping in the kitchen. Mike will show you the ropes." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd, but as Helen met the eyes of her community members, she saw understanding and approval. This too was part of healing. As Thomas was led inside, Helen turned back to the news crew, who had captured the entire exchange. The reporter was speechless, clearly moved by what she had witnessed. "Mrs. Simmons," she said finally, "you've just demonstrated the very essence of what you've been talking about. This is remarkable." Helen smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. "This is what my grandmother's legacy is truly about. Not just nourishing bodies, but healing hearts and rebuilding lives. One bowl of soup at a time." As the day wound down and the last of the visitors left, Helen found herself alone in the kitchen. She ladled out a small bowl of soup, the very recipe that had started it all, and sat at a quiet corner table. As she savored each spoonful, Helen reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had lost so much: her home, her security, nearly her reputation. But in return, she had gained something far more precious: a purpose, a community, and a legacy that would outlive her. The center around her stood as a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of unity, and the enduring magic of a simple act of kindness. As Helen finished her soup, she smiled, knowing that her grandmother would be proud. Outside, the sun set on another day in Boston, but within the walls of the community center, a beacon of hope continued to shine brightly, promising warmth, nourishment, and second chances to all who entered. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.